You're now tuned in to VC Cheat Sheet, the podcast that gives entrepreneurs straight to the point information and behind the scenes access on raising money. Brought to you by the Center for Urban Entrepreneurship and Economic Development at Rutgers University.
You're listening to VC Cheat Sheet, and I'm your host, Melissa S. Jackson. If this is your first time listening, then thank you for tuning in. And if not, thanks for coming back. The goal of the podcast is to help Black and Latino-led startups gain insight into the world of venture and private capital through mentorship and advice. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at TheCued. That's TheCueed. All the links are provided in the show notes at vccheatsheet.com. Now let's get into the show. In this special episode of VC Cheat Sheet, I had the opportunity to speak with entrepreneur, author, and VC extraordinaire Brad Feld of the Foundry Group. Now, Brad has inspired so many people with his book, Venture Deals, and he's made a huge impact on the VC community as a whole. So it was only right that we had this opportunity to speak with a vet and get the ultimate notes for the VC Cheat Sheet. Take a listen. Okay, Brad, so I do want to jump into the topic of negotiations, but before that, I want to get your thoughts on emotional intelligence, especially when it relates to entrepreneurs who are raising funding. What are some thoughts on how you can be better prepared as you walk into that arena for raising?
I think there's a bunch of things that a founder can do today that, even 10 years ago were really hard to do. The first is do real work on the person you're going to be presenting to. So, most investors, whether they're VCs or angel investors, have a digital footprint. They have, Twitter, they have Facebook, maybe they have a blog. There's articles written about them. Do a little bit of research and put a little energy into just understanding the person, at least a public personality of the person that you're going to be meeting with. The second is be self-aware. Be realistic about your own strengths and weaknesses. And don't try to be someone that you're not. Focus on playing to your strengths and advocating for your company and what you're trying to accomplish. But at the same time, don't get in this cycle where you feel like you're putting on an act. If it doesn't feel real, it's going to come across as inauthentic, and that's going to hurt you. And then the last is make sure you're listening. I know so many entrepreneurs who are in such an intense pitch mode that they're not really listening for questions and feedback. And as a result, the person on the other end who you're making a first impression on generally doesn't feel heard. And that also will start you off on the wrong foot.
Totally agree. So let's talk about how early stage companies can find leverage in a world that seems to be so competitive. What are your thoughts there, particularly for early stage companies?
Well, I don't think that anything is fundamentally different. I think the world in general for business and for startups has been competitive since the beginning of time. What's changed is there's so much more information available. There's so much less friction associated with getting that information. And as a founder, figuring out how to separate the signal from the noise is critical. There's an enormous amount of garbage that's talked about, written about, that shows up, from press releases or from companies promoting different things. And it's especially true, when people are constantly trying to put forward a strong, positive, successful image. And as a founder, especially when you're out, whether it's raising money or dealing with competition or trying to land customers, understanding your own, and come back to understanding your own strengths and weaknesses is really key. And I think a lot of founders fall into a trap of being in denial about what's really going on and instead trying to create their own illusion of success. And it's not to say that you shouldn't be optimistic and you shouldn't be forward thinking and you shouldn't, tout your successes, but at the same time recognize, what's working and what's not, and, really put more energy into the things that are working, do more of it, and the things that aren't working, step back and try to figure out why and fix them.
Right. So you just mentioned this idea of you see a lot of entrepreneurs who are trying to do what they see written about or they see on TV. What are one or two things specifically that you've seen that people should shy away from?
Well, I think hyperbole is a big one. There are many, many situations where I'll be on the receiving end of somebody talking to me or presenting to me, and they'll talk about how awesome something is or how great something's going or how well something's working. And if I dig in just a little bit, it's not quite as awesome as the person is talking about.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be just a specific aspect of what you're doing, but in a lot of cases, it's the tone. I mean, most companies are a continuous struggle of, lots of things, not working and some things working and adjusting and fixing the things that aren't working and then having something that is working stop working, and like being clear about where you're at versus just projecting this aura of invincibility and endless awesomeness is one mistake. Another mistake I think a lot of founders make is I would say they fall into cliche land. They repeat things over and over again that sound like cliches rather than being substantive. Here's an example. Somebody says, you say, how you doing? Somebody says, I'm crushing it. And, the phrase I'm crushing it is such a sort of a painful cliche at this point. And, I'll say the question to the person that says they're crushing it. So, well, what do you mean? What's crushing it? And, if the person has nothing behind, well, everything's going great. Well, what do you mean everything's going great? Can you give me some examples? Well, we just sold a piece of business. Well, that's okay. It was, was that your plan for the month? No, your plan was to sell 5 pieces of business. Well, that doesn't sound like you're crushing it. It sounds like you sold a piece of business. So it's sort of not falling into those cliches, whatever they are, is important because it's another thing that tends to turn off investors, but it also causes you to not focus on what's working and what's not working. Instead, you focus on, again, promoting this image of how awesome everything is.
Right. But, how do you frame when things go bad or things aren't going the way you want them to? How do you frame that to a potential investor so you don't come across as someone who's ineffective?
Well, I think you can frame it in the context of what you've learned. Okay. So, if your business fundamentally isn't working, then you probably aren't going to be successful raising money anyway. But if your business is early and you're trying to figure things out and some things are working and some things aren't, the way to frame the things that aren't working is we tried this and it didn't work, but here's what we learned from it. And now here's what we're doing next. So, view the mistakes or the failures as substantive data that helps you improve what you're doing rather than measures of whether you've been successful or not.
Got it. Okay. So what are your thoughts on, this idea of there's a funding dilemma in the VC world related to women and people of color? I know the landscape has changed in the last few years, but what are your thoughts? What have you seen change? What do you think needs to be worked on?
Well, I think a big thing that's started to change is vocal acknowledgement that there is an issue. There was a phrase that, especially in the Bay Area, went around for many, many years, was that Silicon Valley is a meritocracy, and that in some ways that's the ultimate cop out. It's a cop out that comes from a perspective of privilege, right? If you're in a position of privilege, and of course it's a meritocracy, but if you're not in a position of privilege, it's very hard to make progress. And when, you look at the actual year-over-year percentages of either women or people of color who have gotten funding, and those percentages are low single digit against the total population of people that gotten funding, there's clearly an issue. So I think step one is that at least there's a discussion about it now. Second, you're seeing, I'd say it's especially true with gender, but I think it's also becoming more true with ethnicity, is that there's, in addition to just having the conversation, there's more and more support structure of other experienced founders and investors who are actively engaging in extending their community of what they're either working with as entrepreneurs or working with as investors. And it doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of female investors who are funding female-led companies, right? Or male investors who are funding, white male investors who are funding companies run by, men or women of color. What you have is you have more acknowledgement of working on it, and you see a lot more peer groups of other women entrepreneurs engaging with other women entrepreneurs. You see a lot more men playing a role of a male advocate in the context of female entrepreneurs. You see a lot more mentorship of experienced investors mentoring less experienced but up-and-coming female investors. All of these things are starting to work through the system. And interestingly, 5 years ago, very little of this happened because there was just no conversation around it. Right. Today, I think the conversation enables people to start to say, okay, this is a problem. What can we do to improve things?
Right.
All that said, it takes time. It's not a, flip a switch and the next day everything is, equally distributed. And I think that's an important characteristic, which is the impatience combined with recognition that something takes a long period of time. Those two things have to work against each other, with each other, right? It's friction that's good friction, right? You'd be very impatient to make progress against the issue, but recognize that it takes, not a year, not 2 years, not 5, maybe 10 years to make real progress against whether it's, race or gender, ethnicity, sort of in the notion of who's creating companies, who's funding companies. But that at least we're on a curve where it's starting to change.
Okay. Well, just last question. I want to have you play Nostradamus a little bit because I know you're a veteran in the VC world. We've seen, particularly when people throw out the term early stage funding or seed round funding, that shifted from a very small amount to a very large amount. So, just in general, how do you see the tech space, the VC world changing in the next decade? What do you foresee happening? And this is just based off your personal, just based off your personal experience.
I'm not a particularly good predictor, and I don't spend much time trying to be predictive. Mm-hmm. I think the piece of it that I feel very comfortable with that seems like it has had huge impact on what's going on today is this idea that innovation and entrepreneurship has really become much more democratized. And so, it's happening across many, many more geographies, both in the U.S. and around the world. It's happening amongst many different socioeconomic groups. It's happening across many different industry types versus, for example, 20 years ago, the focus was primarily tech, maybe some consumer products, maybe some bio, and all of a sudden, sort of it's happening across the entire landscape. The notion of what entrepreneurship is impacting the way that funding works. So instead of funding really being controlled by a small number of powerful investors, many, many, many more entrepreneurs are able to raise money from many, many more people in lots of different ways. And I think that allows the growth and development of this democratization of entrepreneurship to expand. I think that's, ultimately what venture capital is and the role that it plays in the creation of companies will continue to evolve. But if you think just 10 years ago, there was very little focus internationally. Right? Much of the energy was in the U.S. In fact, 10 years ago, there was very little focus at all on venture capital because we were still dealing with the hangover from the dot-com bubble, even as late as 2006, 2007.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your feedback, Brad. I know that this was
my pleasure.
I know we had some technical difficulties, so we're glad we were able to get you back on.
Happy to do it.
All right. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you subscribe to us on iTunes so you can stay up to date on new episodes featuring more insiders. Have any questions? Leave us a comment on this episode at vccheatsheet.com Or you can tweet us at TheCued, that's TheCueed. Until next time, be great, and it's a wrap.